Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're a wee bit running late, but I'm very, very pleased to welcome Gary West to Newcastle University and also as our keynote speaker for this conference. For me, when I was imagining this conference, which so far has exceeded all my expectations in terms of the conversation about Scottish traditional music or Scottish music more generally, it was a fairly obvious choice to me who I would want to invite as keynote. Gary West is a senior lecturer at Edinburgh University. He's a former director of the School of Scottish Studies. He's also the director of the European Ethnological Centre at Edinburgh University and also is on the board of Creative Scotland. He also is the chair of Traditional Arts and Culture Scotland. But probably more importantly than all that, he has made a substantial contribution over the last several decades to not just the performance of traditional Scottish music, of which probably we're talking in the region of 30 or so commercial albums, but actually more recently, in recent times, has made a substantial contribution to what I see as the emergence in cultural policy of traditional music and traditional arts more broadly, along with other notable figures like Dave as well, who's with us today, Dave Francis. So, could you please give a very warm welcome to Gary West.
Thanks, Simon. Good afternoon to you all. I want to start actually by thanking Simon both for inviting me to give this keynote. I'm very honoured indeed to do this, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the day and a half so far, and as Simon says, all the conversations. I thought we were going to get a wee bit argy-bargy there just before the break. But I also want to congratulate Simon on gaining the AHRC award that led to us all being here in the first place, the fellowship. As many of us know, these are very, very hard things to come by, extremely competitive. And also for the way that you've gone about the whole project, which I think has been very invitational, very communal, very much cooperative, inclusive, consultative with the website and everything that's happening. And I'm not sure if we'll get another chance to do this, so I would just like you to join me in thanking Simon for getting us all here. After David's paper, I don't know what words to use for this, for this talk, so I'll stick to the ones that I wrote down. Okay, but I think some very interesting points there. I find the title of this conference intriguing. Actually, not just for what it is, but also for what it's not. It is Understanding Scotland Musically. Now, to me that means that the subject is Scotland. Understanding Scotland is presumably our aim, our goal, our destination. Musically is the qualifier, the particular path that we're being invited to tread to get towards that understanding. It's not understanding Scotland's music, which is what I thought it was when I started writing the paper, and then realised, no, it's not. It's understanding Scotland musically. It's not understanding Scotland's music, or some other such phrase where the goal of our understanding would be the music, if you get my point. In other words, there might be, just as well, another group of people similar to us sitting somewhere else, right at this moment, going about the business of understanding Scotland in some other way, understanding Scotland politically, which is something many of us have been trying to do, failing perhaps in the last couple of years. Understanding Scotland economically, understanding Scotland geographically, geologically, anthropologically, sociologically. Sociologically interesting, of course, because David McCrone used that as a title for his seminal book on Scotland, Understanding Scotland. Originally, the sociology of a stateless nation. After 1999 reprints, it became, I noticed, Understanding Scotland, the sociology of a nation. The stateless had been perhaps prematurely dropped. So, understanding Scotland is our aim, I would suggest. But of course, music is our path, the pathway that we've been invited to go along to get there, to negotiate as we go. So of course we do need to explore the music that is our guide along that track. But one more qualification, this is where I have to be careful after David's paper this morning, but one more qualification has been given to us in the call for papers, that it's not just a musical path per se, it's a path that's been labelled variously traditional music, folk music, but as David and others have told us and reminded us, there are many other musical paths that we could be following in order to try to get to this destination of potential understanding with different labels on them. And we've heard lots about them already this week. There's classical and there's jazz and there's indie and there's rock over there. And the paths are all crossing, of course. They're not by any means parallel paths. And all of these, again, as David and others have reminded us, have their own traditions as well. All artists work from within traditions in the sense of knowing their place within that continuum. Perhaps some of the ones who time reveres as the greatest ones are the ones who step off that path and start their own paths and hope that others will follow. So yes, music, folk music, trad music is our labelled pathway that we need to explore. That's what we've been mainly doing over these couple of days. My job, as I see it in a keynote, I think, is to talk to the title of the conference. That's what I always feel a keynote should do. And to try to make sure that we don't lose sight of our intended destination and understanding Scotland musically. Do we? Can we? Is my title. So, starting point. There are, of course, things that I think we already understand about Scotland, irrespective of which path we might be following. First of all, that it is a nation. Despite all the forensic examination that's taken place in particular over the last 2 years of what Scotland is, what it is not, what it has been, what it might yet be, I've seen little or no denial of that fact, the fact of nationhood. Not a sovereign nation, not statehood, or perhaps only partly so, that could be a grey area. Not a body that can confer citizenship, but a nation nonetheless. So what is a nation? Again, others have nodded towards this in various papers already. And we do have scholarship that addresses that question. Some composed by people who believe that nations are natural entities, the natural order of things, that their form and scale and their way of being is the result of a process of historical development which just makes sense. Nations are axioms to these fundamentalists, you might call them. At the other end of the spectrum, there are scholars who see nations as entirely constructed entities. And yet both camps often imbue them with qualities that go well beyond those of an organisation or political unit. Ernest Renan, for example, who I don't think has been mentioned yet, a 19th century Breton theorist, began a famous lecture at Sorbonne in 1882 by claiming that a nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Not has a soul, but is a soul. Now, however we might define the idea of a soul, it's always a very big thing, a big word. It always means something of consequence, something intrinsic, something of absolute fundamental value, whether we happen to have religious faith and conviction or not. I don't, but still see soul as very powerful indeed. If we were to accept Renan's articulation that a nation is a soul, we might reasonably ask, does music help to define that national soul? Leave that hanging for a minute. Benedict Anderson, who has been mentioned already, also sees nations, of course, as constructions, famously labelling them imagined communities. Not imagined in the sense of not being real, but imagined because they're too large to be actual communities, where people tend to know each other, interact with each other, talk about each other, fall in with each other, fall out with each other. A nation's too big for that, usually. So we have to construct a sense of it. We have to imagine it. So if we were to accept that idea, then does music help to create these imaginings? Personally, I'm quite happy to accept both of these ideas and to consider both of these questions. But for me, my personal conceptualization is that a nation is its people, their relationships, and their creations, their creativity. Relationships, I lump a lot into that one. Relationships with each other, relationships with other nations beyond the borders. Also, however, their relationships with the environment, place, we might call it, and their relationships with time, past, present, and perhaps their imaginings of the future. I do believe that music, and traditional music, folk music, can hold a torch to these things, and can do so in a continuous and in a lasting and a creative and inspirational way. So yes, I believe music can help to give a nation its soul, if we want to be slightly fanciful about it, and can and does fuel our imaginings, definitely, of what the nation is and can be. And I think folk music, traditional music, can actually do these things particularly well. But I don't think that creators of music and performers of music necessarily set out to do those things terribly often. I'd say that's a vital distinction, actually, that the concept of nation, of Scotland, is not necessarily often in creators' minds when they are creating. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and we've heard about some of them already. It's my contention that we tend to be more concerned with the local and the global than we are with the national. That we are concerned with the immediate and the ultimate without necessarily pausing somewhere in between. So one of my arguments is that we can be in danger, probably for political reasons as much as anything else, and I say that as a yes voter, of emphasising the national at the expense of the local. When we were having a discussion yesterday about the Proclaimers and Arab Strap after Arnar's paper, I think it was, it did occur to me that in the trad world, people are not singing in Scottish accents. They're singing in their own voices, wherever they happen to be from. It's not usually a marketing ploy or a deliberate attempt to create a niche or brand. They're just singing the way they speak. I like that. I think that's very important. I think it's one of the great strengths, actually, of our music, whatever we want to call it. Michael Mara voiced Dundee, but also Lochee specifically. Davy Steele voiced East Lothian, or specifically Preston Pans. Nancy Nicholson voices Wick, and so on. Now, I hear somebody shouting to me right now. He's called Patrick Geddes. He's saying, yes, act local, think global. That was one of his great catchphrases. Geddes, a man whose work I think has much to say to us still, particularly if we're trying to get our heads around this label folk. There's plenty of scholarship, as we know, about what folk is and is not, especially in the context of music and lore. Don't have time to get into that, and I think I do accept David's point that perhaps we shouldn't anyway. But if you forgive me a quick wee detour into the evergreen mind and world of Patrick Geddes, hopefully it'll become clear why. Geddes had a very interesting take on folk. It was he who picked up and adapted Frederick Le Play's ideas and moulded them to his own experience in Scotland. Frederick Le Play, that 19th century French polymath and protagonist of several of the great exhibitions of the second half of the 1800s, who was fascinated by the constituent parts of society, of nation indeed, insisting that a true understanding of how it all works requires the close study of the basic components, the parts rather than the whole. And the parts he held in highest regard were place, work and family, a triumvirate which was later to be reframed in Edinburgh by Patrick Geddes, who preferred to think in terms of place, work and folk. So folk rather than family, that was the substitution. What's that about? A widening out? Perhaps a recognition that there had to be a bridge between the parts and the whole, and it was the people, the folk, which provided that. But which folk? Who are the folk? Why folk particularly, and not just the more neutral people? The answer for Geddes lay partly, I suspect, in one issue which fascinated him, which was the nature of relationships between people. If you remember, that's one of my key words for understanding a nation. Now, forgive me for a further detour, this time into biology. He had been a student of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a biologist of great note, one of the key disciples of Charles Darwin. But he took Darwin's ideas about competition to extremes that Darwin himself hadn't done. Huxley believing that the survival of the fittest, that's really where that thing came from, the survival of the fittest was the central rule of any species' success. Now, Geddes preferred other Darwinian lines of evolution of his ideas, if you forgive the pun, which pointed out that the cooperation was just as important as competition. Cooperation, just as important as competition. One of the key thinkers on that side was the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin. Prince Peter, he was sometimes called. Fascinating character, needs a whole conference of his own. But he wrote a very influential book called Mutual Aid, in which he attempted to prove the point that cooperation was crucial to the development and success of anything, and cited all manner of examples which ranged from reciprocity amongst crustaceans to the existence of the Royal National Lifeboat Institute. He went to Edinburgh in 1886 to visit Geddes, Patrick Geddes, and several other like-minded people, like-minded folk. Perhaps incidentally, Marjorie Kennedy Fraser was part of that same social circle. I don't know if she met Kropotkin. She was certainly visiting Geddes in his home around that time. It does seem to me that lying at the heart of Geddes' conceptualization of folk, then, was the desire and need for mutual understanding, for working with rather than working against. So the folk for Geddes, I think, were people who cooperate. Now, for quite a long time in the study of folk culture, folklore, folk music, there was a working assumption that folk arts were communally created. That idea went out in about the 1960s or 70s. Dan Ben Amos's essay Towards the Definition of Folk Music in Context in the Journal of American Folklore in 1971 was one of the key texts that finally put that one to bed. But what he did argue was that the process of recreation does tend to be central to the folk ethos. There's little emphasis on the sanctity of the text, he said, be it lyric or tune, but constant recreation as it travels on its merry way through space and time. Of course, folk music by no means has the monopoly on that process of reshaping, but it's certainly the backbone of the arts of tradition, if we can perhaps introduce that phrase, which I notice is coming into the lexicon a little bit these days. Donald Smith is very fond of it, the arts of tradition. So, enough of this contextual stuff. I'm just trying to plough the ground here. But suffice to say, just to try and bring together what I'm saying so far, a nation like Scotland can perhaps be understood by considering its people, their relationships, and their creativity, in this case music. And that by taking a Geddes approach, Geddesian approach, and perspective on the concept of folk, there is communality and recreation involved along that pathway. But in Scotland, I argue that communality and recreation is often aimed at the local, looking out to the global, and may or may not stop in between at the national, stop off in between at the national. So, I'd like to explore some of these ideas through music, and particularly through song, despite being a piper, but to keep to some kind of focus for this, some kind of thread, binding thread. I'm going to introduce one theme really to follow from here on in. And here in 2014, 100 years after the start of one of the most horrendous human conflicts in all history, there's every reason to make that the theme of war. Another personal reason as well, I'm just back, having spent a few days in France with the project Far, Far from Ypres, music and songs of the First World War, a narrated musical stage show put together by Ian McCalman. Played in Scotland, several venues, and we were invited not to the Western Front itself, but to a small town, Martignaz, near Bordeaux. Being part of that initiative, I have to say, has been a very sobering yet extremely inspiring experience. It's brought to the front of my mind these three components of nationhood, of which I've just been speaking, and especially the issue of our relationship with time. How we remember, indeed how we forget, the process of personal and collective memorialization, the ways we relate to and recreate the past, what that means to our present and indeed to our future. Our relationship with time is one of my main interests, actually, academically. How we use the past within the present, which is why I'm fascinated by things that link the two. Tradition, which flows into the present from the past, arguably. Heritage, our highly selective interpretation and packaging of the past to suit our political and economic needs of the present. And revivalism, the deliberate reintroduction of the past into the present. Now, one song which features in the Far, Far from Ypres show is a fairly recent composition by Jim Malcolm, which sits, in my opinion, very comfortably alongside the best work of the celebrated soldier poets themselves, of Owen, Sassoon, Brooke, Graves, Rosenberg, Gurney, Edward Thomas, and the Scottish voices, also Charles Sorley, Roderick Watson-Kerr, Violet Jacob, E.A. McIntosh, John Buchan, W.D. Cocker, Joseph Lee. I completely agree with the point made earlier, that poetry and music very, very closely intertwined in much of the Scottish tradition, constant bedfellows in many ways. Jim Malcolm's contribution belongs in that kind of company, I think. But of course, making that contribution the best part of a century after they all were. Jimmy's Gone to Flanders. That's both title and refrain. It's a straightforward, unembellished, stark fact. Jimmy's gone to Flanders. The voice we hear is that of his mother, maybe talking to a neighbour, maybe just talking to nobody in particular, to herself, to the walls. She lives in Perthshire, somewhere on the River Erne, Crieff maybe, and Jimmy and his pals are away with the local regiment Blackwatch. Jimmy's Gone to Flanders. The fear of that fact, the pain of that fact is left unsaid, but it's there in the song, no doubt about it, simmering under the surface. But she has to stay on the surface. She can't let herself imagine, can't allow her mind to wander and to wonder what he's doing, what it's like, what is his fate. So she does what mothers do. She talks like mothers talk. She moans that he's a messy bugger, that he's away to Flanders and he's left his fiddle lying about, and it was his late father's fiddle too. He's not cleaned his football boots, he's not sorted his fishing gear from the last time he was out, and he and Willie should never have been out that night anyway. There was no moonlight at Africa. But she can allow herself a wee peek into the future when Jimmy comes home, as she has to believe he will, to his fiddle and his mucky boots and to good moonlit fishing. It's a love song, the love of a mother for her son, that most unbendable, unshakable, unspeakable form of love, perhaps. And here it is left unspoken, the sentiment understated, and for me a song that's all the more powerful for that. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, his fiddle's lying on his bed. It was his father's fiddle, though he's I'd been shy to practice it. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, his fishing gear's a tangle since the night he and Willie fished the end, though there was nae moon. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, he spiled the old dog rotten wi' scraps below the table, though I've telled him time and time again. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, his football bits are sodden and they've no been near Dublin since he bought them new fae Sandy Boone. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, though he has, when Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, he'll be shamed to clean they football boots and sort out all yon tangle, for the Erna here is fishing good. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, we'll all sit in round the table and we'll coax him to his fiddle. Jimmy, he's the born o' Highlanders. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, though he has a job at Logie's Yard. All the lads were joining, it'll all be done by Christmas time. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, though he's no the strength his father was. I ken he'll be worthy, and that jockey would he burst with pride. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, I ken he has a lassie, her father saw them walking by themselves below the falls of May. Jimmy's gone to Flanders, he's as secret as his father was, but I caught her weeping as the sergeant marched him to the train. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, you'll be shamed to clean they football bits and sort out all yon tangle, for the Erna here is fishing good. When Jimmy's hame fae Flanders, we'll all sit in round the table and we'll coax him to his fiddle. Jimmy, he's the born o' Highlanders. I'm grateful to Jim Malcolm for leaving the ending of that song up to us. There's an old theory that was all the rage for a while concerning the ability of traditional ballad singers to recreate the story on each telling. I'm sure you know it well. Based on a framework of the plot, a knowledge and deep understanding of the ballad structure and metre, and a lively imagination. It's called the oral formulaic theory, put forward by Milman Parry and Albert Lord, taken to new levels by the late, much lamented John Miles Foley in the US, and championed as far as Scotland was concerned by the folklorist David Buchan. This is a wee bit like that, but not quite, slightly different. The text remains the same, more or less, on each telling, but we can fill in the ending for ourselves. We, the listener, can recreate the story on each listening. Jim Malcolm has respected the communal process of recreation in a particular way, subtly inviting each singer and each listener to invest in the story on each performance. Does Jimmy come home, sitting by the table and give them the Born o' Highlanders, or are his boots left uncleaned his gear tangled, his fiddle silent, his girl broken-hearted, and his mother just broken. I have a boy just about the same age as Jimmy, who leaves his boots manky and his fiddle lying about. For me, Jimmy has to have come home. Therefore, I can't contemplate it any other way. And in Jimmy's mother, well, she's my mother. No doubt about it, but you might be sitting there thinking, no, she's my mother. This song is Geddes in action, unstintingly, locally, achingly global, and as we know only too well, tragically timeless. But is it also in between? If there's such a thing as a Scottish psyche, well, maybe for me it's there in that song, in that woman, Mother Scotland, perhaps, rather fancifully. But on a purely personal level, since hearing and learning and contemplating that song, I feel I understand just a little bit more than I did before. What it is I understand, I'm not sure. Is it Scotland? I'll come back to that. Just over the county march from Jimmy's mother was another mother, a very real mother, not an imagined mother this time, an Angus mother whose boy didn't come home. A mother who also happened to have a wonderfully creative talent for poetics, a local yet global voice, a mother called Violet Jacob. To listen to her poetry, some of it later set to music by Jim Reid in particular, you'd think she was a kitschy dame, a firm lassie out working the parks, milking the kye, a kind of Chris Guthrie in Sunset Song, a lass of Perts, a living example of that confused duality of land and books, of soil and learning. In some respects she was, but in fact she was born Violet Augusta Mary Frederica Kennedy Erskine, of Angus landed gentry and granddaughter of the illegitimate child of King William IV, no less. But she is nonetheless in every sense a folk poet, one who time and time again catches the essence of locality, of community, of people and their interrelations, of the seasonal cycles of work and belief and celebration and time, in this case also of gentle mourning. Her son died in the final weeks of the Battle of the Somme, 1916, on a date that for most in her community year in and year out brought perennial fun and frolics, October the 31st. The tatty lifting's nearly through, they're ploughing where the barley grew, and after dark round ilka stack you'll see the horsemen stand and crack. O Lachlan, but a mind on you. A mind fu often we hae seen 10,000 stars keep down atween the naked branches, and below baith firm and bothy hae their show aglow wi' lichts o' Halloween. There's bairns wi' gizzards at their tail, clouring the door wi' runts o' kale, and fine you'll hear the screeks and skirls o' lassies wi' their drooked curls, bobbing for apples aye the pale. The bothy fire is loupen het, and you heed horsemen's kiss is set, richt there the lamp or by the blaze, the Algin stood that kept your clays. I canna thole to see it yet. But gin the old folks' tales are richt, and guests come hame on Hallow-nicht, oh friends, what would I gie to feel ye racks your hand to me, atween the dark and the Connell's licht. Awa in France across the wave, the wee lichts burn on ilka grave, and you and me their lows hae seen, you'll maybe hae your Halloween, yont warrior lying wi' the lave. There's drink and daffin, sang and dance, and ploys and kisses get their chance, but Lachlan man, the place I see, is where the old kissed used to be, and the lichts o' Halloween in France. That song's included in the Ypres show too. I find it a deeply emotional creation. Perhaps it's because those are very much my own family roots. One of the horsemen standing amongst the stacks having a bit of crack could easily have been my grandfather. But of course, there are a lot of high emotion songs in the Scots canon. That's sometimes spoken of as a bad thing. It's been mentioned a few times already yesterday, that we are prone towards the sentimental. But personally, I don't see what's wrong with a healthy dose of sentiment. It touches us, it stirs us, it gars us greet, perhaps. Maybe therein lies a defence mechanism of the Scottish psyche, the generations of cultural shaping that steers us away from outward displays of emotion. Maybe such songs are our release valve, the vent that complements the gentle hand on the shoulder. But perhaps also the songs of the past speak to us in the present because they unlock contemporary realities too. When I hear or sing Jim Malcolm's Jimmy's Gone to Flanders or Violet Jacobs' Halloween, I see a much more recent figure in front of me, a real mother of today, a mother called Rose Gentle, whose son Gordon, newly recruited into the Royal Highland Fusiliers, was killed in Iraq in 2004, age 19, fresh out of basic training at Catterick. Rose, you might recall, campaigned after his death for withdrawal of troops from Iraq and for adequate equipment for them in all war zones. Rose did not stay silent, did not leave her brokenness understated, but did speak out with reason, with dignity and with determination. And speaking out with determination has been part of the songmaker's craft within the revival period in Scotland too, if we can call it that. We might think of the Anti-Polaris song campaign, gathered together in the collection Ding Dong Dollar, in particular, as we heard yesterday, as the towers in the sea that Sorley MacLean found so fundamentally disturbing, disgusting and wrong. Or Nancy Nicholson's sweetly angry compositions delivered in a jaunty playground manner which belie the sharp sting of satirical rebuke they contain. Songs like Geordie, Geordie, Bush, Bush, Geordie, Geordie, Bush, Bush, Geordie, Geordie, Bush, Bush, had a terrible toy box. It was full of bombs and guns, bloody great enormous ones. Duck, my darling, here it comes, Geordie Bush's toy box. She was a primary teacher. Or Dick Gaughan's utopian imagining of a future without war in Childhood's End. We'll lay the last old soldier to rest today, the lingering relic of the older way. No muffled roars of drums, no flags that wave in the breeze that wasn't blowing. And on the spot where he was laid, we lit a flame to burn forevermore until the end of time. For all the other soldiers, known and unnamed, no gun salute was fired, no last pose playing. Childhood's end was long in coming, but come it must, for all our fears, for all our vanity, for all our stumbling. Childhood's end is drawing near. Or Michael Mara's retelling of the tragic story of Ewan Havendale, Chris Guthrie's young husband in Grasset Gibbon's Sunset Song, who was shot for desertion from the trenches of the Western Front. Hampton missed these 25 eventful years seem to me now, and in all but one a friendly haze, a ghost of gladness by my side. With horse and plough I marched with pride of the purest kind. Then a flash of light, and it's Flanders Field and the end of time. And through the mist and cannon's roar, I saw my Christine's smiling eyes. And with no more thought of blood or shell, I made my way to hold her near. But truth and honour's henchmen found me, leaving here the madman's rave, the coward's grave for the volunteer. Many others too. There are just a few examples of more recent dealings in folk idiom, loosely speaking, with war. But the Great War didn't just spawn words, it gave us some cracking tunes too. I've had to talk about bagpipes at some point. We've heard a fair bit about pipes and piping, quite rightly in my opinion, if we're going to understand Scotland musically. The Great Highland Bagpipe captures, I think, maybe some of the flavour of paradox that's probably inherent in all nations. A national instrument, so-called, an icon of Scottishness, certainly, loved, hated, revered, dismissed, lauded, joked about, at once providing the music of angels and the music of the devil. Both metaphors are very well ingrained in the iconography of piping, as Hugh Cheek in particular has shown. And it's always been thus, words of praise and dispraise of the bagpipe pepper early Gaelic poetry, and that duality has been our constant companion ever since, as many of us in this room know all too well. I've often wondered if it's partly because the whole essence of the bagpipe is mood. The melody notes against the omnipresent drone will give us both bitter and sweet, consonance, dissonance, triumph, despair. I was reminded of the power of the instrument to evoke extremes of mood at the weekend there on that trip to Bordeaux, where within, must have been about a 12-hour period, I was first of all asked to get a party going with a rake of good-going reels designed, as one of my fellow artists said, to get the place just louping. And the next morning to take part in what was a deeply moving ceremony in the small town of Martignas on the outskirts of Bordeaux. It was that town's main commemoration week of the Great War centenary, as well as some military pomp and ceremony. A dozen local children each read out sections of letters written during the Great War by soldiers from France, from Scotland, from Senegal, and indeed from Germany. Beautifully touching and thought-provoking part of the ceremony, I thought. My job was to stand for 50 minutes and then hope that my drones were still in tune and play a lament. And I've always found playing the Flowers of the Forest a deeply moving thing to do, partly I suppose from personal experience of having done it at a graveside at a fairly young age. To do so in front of a French war memorial rather than a Scottish one somehow heightened that. Now there's an occasion where a nation did come very much into focus. Playing the bagpipe in an act of remembrance on foreign soil cannot but bring Scotland into the frame, for me anyway. In this case, to understand Scotland not as somewhere different to these other nations, but as somewhere very much the same. At that point, Jimmy's mother was no longer Mother Scotland, she was the universal mother. If we're all Jack Tamson's bairns, then she became Mistress Tamson. But interestingly, the Great War itself gave us some cracking pipe tunes. Very few were laments, however. Rather, it gifted us the march, that jaunty, cheery, gallus, stately genre, 6/8, 2/4, 4/4 for going forward, 3/4 and 9/8 for coming back again, the retreat air. That, of course, is the job of the piper in war, to inspire and to incite. As the piping commentator and historian Colonel David Murray has said, it was to incite alacrity in the soldier. The morning can wait until after. So, a couple of examples. These are Scottish small pipes, made by the aforementioned Hamish Moore, that we were hearing a little bit earlier. Composed by young Willie Laurie of Ballachulish, one of the great piping prodigies of his day, probably the Gordon Duncan of his day in many respects, and pipe major of the 8th Argyles. He didn't survive the war, taking ill in the trenches, died in a military hospital in Oxford in 1916. Many of his tunes, I think there's about 20, remain in most pipers' repertoires to this day. Creeks, composed by James Robertson of the Gordon Highlanders while a prisoner of war in Germany in 1915. He wrote it on the back of a piece of yellow blotting paper that he still had 40 years later when Hamish Henderson visited him in Banff. And finally, Fields of Flanders, composed by Pipe Major John McClellan, a quiet, shy lad, by all accounts, from Dunoon, who fought in the Boer War with the Highland Light Infantry, and in the Great War as a piper under Willie Laurie, aforementioned, from Ballaghulish in the 8th Argylls. He too left us some of the most beautiful melodies in the piping canon. Lochinside, for example, played by, I would say, probably every Highland piper in the world today. Now, in these last two tunes, Farewell to the Creeks and The Bloody Fields of Flanders, we have two very different flavours of music from two very different war experiences. John McClellan fought right through the conflict and knew in intimate detail the horrors of the Bloody Fields of Flanders. James Robertson, though, was captured early on, and as a prisoner of war could escape in his mind's ear to the creeks of Portnocky, a favourite childhood hideaway on the Banffshire coast. In terms of my three keywords, people, relationships, creativity, James Robertson means a lot to me personally, for he was the first piping teacher of my main piping teacher, Ian Duncan. These things mean a lot to us pipers. Ian Duncan, brother and early mentor of Gordon Duncan, who Megan mentioned yesterday, and who was in turn the key teacher and guru for Ross Ainsley, who we saw and heard in the two fusion bands yesterday, Salsa Celtica and the Treacherous Orchestra. The timelines from the mud of Flanders to the sweat of the Barrowlands are short indeed. Pedigree, it might be called if we were being fanciful, or if we were dogs. But for us it really is about understanding, I think, understanding the lines of connection of which we are a part, respecting them, being inspired by them, not being furrowed to them. Roots are not tethers. They do not bind us to the past, but they do connect us to and nurture our present and indeed our future. Those two tunes do have something very much in common, for they were, as I'm sure you recognise, both given a new pathway after the Second World War, when they were borrowed by Hamish Henderson, used for two of his best known songs, the Highland Division's Farewell to Sicily and Freedom Come All Ye. Now there's the communal recreation process at work. It was beautifully captured actually on tape when Hamish visited James Robertson in 1953. By that time he was working as a janitor in Banff. James, not Hamish, I can't imagine Hamish in a room somehow. And Hamish first sang him the song he'd put to James's tune. I've written about this in Book Voicing Scotland. I don't have time to go into it in much detail just now, but it's a wonderful moment. For me, it's a seminal moment of the meeting of two highly creative minds, a symbolic synthesis flowering out of the combined experiences of two world wars. So, running out of time, let's just fast forward a little bit. Where does all this take us? All I've been able to do here is pick up on just one theme, which is certainly prevalent in the music and song traditions, the folk traditions of Scotland, war, and to try to point towards some examples of the way in which my personal ingredients of nationhood come together to speak to me. And they do speak to me powerfully. They do have something important to say to me here in the 21st century of 2014. I do feel genuinely that the folk tradition can and does speak to the big issues of life today, of love and hate, of peace and conflict, of humanity, inhumanity, of belonging and sometimes of not belonging, and particularly of Geddes' place, work and folk. And I do believe that in an increasingly globalising world there are things that are more important than, I do believe that in an increasingly globalising world those are things which are increasingly important. The fear of globalisation is the fear of sameness, the fear of homogeneity, the fear that we're moving rapidly towards a single world culture. But as I've argued before, again in Voicing Scotland, there can instead be positive globalisation, which involves a recognition and celebration of cultural difference. So let's not fuse everything. If we get too much fusion, as I said yesterday, we'll perhaps have to engage in a little fishing. Understanding Scotland musically, can we? I think perhaps that this is a pathway that can lead us to some kind of understanding of this nation of Scotland, perhaps more at the level of each of us as individuals, individual understanding, rather than as some kind of agreed, homogeneous recipe. Because music is art, and we react to art in ways that we can't always predict, can't always explain, can't always understand. If we're seeking an understanding of Scotland, I have a hunch that we're more likely to find it when we're not looking for it. We'll only understand Scotland musically when we begin to reach a better understanding of its constituent parts. Thank you.